Good morning. Good to see everybody this morning. We're in Deuteronomy, which we've been doing this quarter, and we're in chapter 16 of Deuteronomy. He's going to go through the feast days as we open up this chapter. So let's begin with chapter 16, verse 1. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. The Passover was to be observed in the month of Abib, which after the Babylonian captivity was called Nisan. So sometimes you'll be reading along and you'll see the month of Nisan. Well, it's the same month. It's just changed names in the Babylonian captivity. This is our March, April. That's the time frame we're looking at there, according to our present calendar. Passover was the Independence Day for Israel. In other words, when you think Passover, think July 4th, because that would be comparable. Now, obviously, their Independence Day carries a whole lot more meaning than ours does, because they were actual slaves in the land of Egypt. They'd been complaining for a long period of time. So their independence meant more to them than ours did, even no matter how strongly you feel about our Independence Day. The feast celebrated their deliverance from the Egyptian captivity. So then he goes on, verse 2. Therefore, you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. You shall eat no unleavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, that is, the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day in which you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. Okay, think about when they left Egypt. Did they plan for it like you plan for a big vacation? Did they get the suitcases out and were they packing, a little bit along? No, that's not how it went. They went out suddenly. They were thrown out of Egypt in a certain sense of the word, because Pharaoh did not like what was going on at all. He'd lost his firstborn, and many others had in the land. He drove them out. And so when they loaded up, what'd they do? They loaded up bread that had no leaven in it. It was not prepared in that way. And so each year when they had the Passover sacrifice that they celebrated, they would have no leaven to remind them of coming out of Egypt, what it was like in those days. Now, there are a couple of things to notice. There's also called a Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it goes 7 days. And if you read the way this is written, it sounds like the two run together, one right after the other. And as far as I can tell, even in New Testament times, that's true, so that when Jesus is raised from the dead, he's raised the day after a high holy day. Or 2 days after, actually, if you count Saturdays one day and Sundays another. You got Friday. He's crucified on Friday. You got the high holy day on Saturday. He's still in the grave then. He's raised on Sunday. So, and they're eating unleavened bread at that point in time. Why does that matter? Because you got the 3,000 that are baptized on the day of Pentecost, and then they do what? They partake of the Lord's Supper. What kind of bread would they have had? It had been unleavened, because it's the same bread they ate in the Passover. What kind of bread did Jesus use when he instituted the Lord's Supper? Well, he was at the Passover feast, and so the bread he used was unleavened bread. So you wonder, why do we use the bread we use? You might say, I much prefer sourdough. Well, I say, as far as taste goes, I agree with you. I prefer it too. But if we're going to do it God's way, then we're not going to have leaven. And you will notice in Scripture that many times leaven is used to represent sin. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul talks about Christ, our Passover sacrifice for us, and he talks about getting rid of the leaven of sin in the church. In chapter 5, all this goes together. See, it all fits. But you got to think about all of it as one giant picture instead of looking at the little bitty parts. Put it all together, and it goes together real nicely. So that's Passover. Here, the word is used comprehensively, Clyde Wood says, to include the accompanying Feast of Unleavened Bread, verse 16, as is clear from the phrase, 7 days you shall eat it. That's verse 3, which we've already read. So Brother Woods is pointing us in the direction that I've already talked about. The bread of affliction, according to Brother Woods, was the unleavened bread recalled Israel's anxious and hurried escape from their hated bondage. And Brother Woods references Exodus chapter 12. That's when the death of the firstborn happens. That's when they're driven out. And then we read verses 4 through 8 in Deuteronomy 16. And no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory for 7 days, nor shall any of the meat which you sacrifice the first day at twilight remain overnight until morning. You may not sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at twilight, at the going down of the sun, at the time you came out of Egypt. It's a yearly reminder of their release from Egypt. It is a victory celebration in some ways because they're victorious over the Egyptians and they're going out. There are a number of things to think about as you think about all of these things. For example, the place that the Lord would name. Had you ever thought that moved? You've got it at Shiloh. Later, you seem to have it at Gilgal for a period of time, and finally it's at Jerusalem. That's where God finally places his name ultimately. But wherever the Lord's tabernacle is, later the temple, wherever the tabernacle is, that's the place that God wants them to come sacrifice the Passover. That's to be an annual observance. Now, how did they do this? I want you to remember if you look back and find the directions there in Exodus, you're going to see they took a lamb, they cut the throat of the lamb, and they caught all the blood in a basin. Now, in the Israelites, when they first did it, would then take the blood and they took a hyssop branch. That's the nearest way I know how to describe it. Just think of a bush out in your yard, and you got something like it anyway. And they dip it in the blood, and then they painted it, as it were, on the doorpost of their house, on the lintel and the doorpost of their house. That blood was the reason that God passed over those houses and none of the firstborn died. Now, think about all that as a symbol, because remember, we've already said it, 1 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. So what do we know? You got to have Jesus' blood on the lintel and doorposts of your house, your spiritual house, your individual spiritual house. So if I've got to have his blood, now I'm looking for a big amount of blood. Because remember, they cut the throat, they bled it into a basin, so we're looking for a big amount of blood. Did Jesus bleed when they scourged him? I dare say he did, but not a big amount of blood, because he still lived. Been a big amount of blood, he'd been dead, because life's in the blood, remember? Genesis chapter 9 talks about that. So when did he shed a big amount of blood? Well, they put a crown of thorns on his head. Did he bleed then? Well, probably. That wouldn't surprise me. It wasn't a big amount of blood. But then watch John 19:31-35, where they come to Jesus' cross. They see that he's dead already. And what do? soldier pierced his side with a spear, and forthwith comes out blood mingled with water. That sounded like a big amount of blood to me. That sounded like a basin full, if you want to, envision it that way. Okay, so where did Jesus leave his blood? He left it in his death. Now, if I want it on my spiritual doorposts, where am I going to go to find it? Well, I got to go to his death, right? Now, there are only two passages that I know of that specifically tell how to get to the death of Christ. One is Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, and the other one is Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, and both say you are buried with him. Well, Romans is particularly buried with him in baptism into death. So where do I contact the death of Christ? In baptism. And when I do that, the blood's on my lintel of my doorpost, so to speak. Okay, is everybody with me? That's, when I was younger, I couldn't have put all those pieces together. And I'm sure there are more pieces I still don't know. But these are the pieces I know right now, and I'm trying to share with you as we go through. Okay, so there's a part of what we're looking at. We want to go ahead and read all the way through the 8th verse. You shall roast and eat it, this is talking about the lamb, in the place which the Lord your God chooses, and in the morning you shall turn and go to your tent. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a sacred assembly to the Lord your God. You shall do no work on it. So the 7th day was particularly marked by a special closing ceremony. That's according to, again, Clyde Woods. And he referenced particularly Leviticus chapter 23, verse 36. Okay, so that's the feast of the Passover. And you can already see all the males in Israel were supposed to be wherever God's name was. Okay, so the time Jesus comes along, where is that? Jerusalem. By the time Jesus comes along, that's where it is. So where do you find Jesus every Passover? In Jerusalem. Now there's one, you do a little bit of research here, there's one where his brothers say, basically, aren't you going? And he indicates, well, you need to go on up, but he doesn't say he's going. But he does go. You don't see Jesus miss a Passover. You ever wonder, how do we know how long Jesus walked with his apostles on the earth? Count Passovers. That's how you know. There are 3 Passovers. Now, he may have walked with them a little bit before the first one, and so we say 3.5 years. That's a ballpark. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. Do I know exactly? No, I don't know exactly. I'm just giving you a good ballpark. I'm telling you how we get it. By looking at the Passover feast. All right, next feast is called sometimes the Feast of Weeks, but in the New Testament, guess what it's called? Pentecost. Pentecost. Most people are familiar with the word Pentecost. Now, where do you get that from? Let me ask it to you this way. How many sides does the United States Pentagon have? It has 5, right? Pentecost, just take 5 and add a 0 to it. 50. 50. Okay, now watch. If you count 7 Sabbaths, how many days is that? It's 49, right? What would Sunday be then? It'd be number 50. Is that right? There's your Passover. Pentecost, excuse me. I'll wake up after a while, okay? There's Pentecost, okay? That's what we're talking about. All right. So everybody go with me now. We're going to look at verses 9 through 12, chapter 16 of Deuteronomy. You should count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you should keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of a free will offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you should be careful to observe these statutes. Okay, so where do they celebrate Pentecost? Same place they celebrate Passover. So by the time we get to when the Lord's alive, we're talking about Jerusalem again, aren't we? That's where it is. So does it surprise us then that Peter and the other apostles are in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost? No, doesn't surprise. They ought to be there. They're required by the Mosaic law to be there. All right, very important to see that. Roger Dixon and his little work, by the way, you can get that free online. It's digital. If you don't know how to find it, we'll get you a link, some way if you want it. He says the Feast of Weeks, this feast was for 7 consecutive weeks, beginning at the time of the harvest, Leviticus 23, 4 through 11. This was to be a period of great rejoicing as they witnessed their harvest for the year and remembered the blessings of God. Later known as Pentecost, already told you that. Brother Wood says, undergirding benevolence, indeed all obedience was the memory of their bondage and the Lord's gracious redemption. Okay, think about this. Why are Jews and later Christians supposed to take care of widows? Because God has always taken care of his people in trouble. And for the Israelites, that's easy to remember. We were in Egypt, God took care of us, he got us out. Okay, when a widow is within your number, when a orphan is within your number, when a stranger comes in, what are you supposed to do? Take care of them. So you notice that this day called Pentecost, they make sure they take care of who? Widows, orphans, strangers. Did you notice that? It's all in the text. See, it's all right there. And it's a memorial, it's a remembrance of God took care of us. God brought us out. Everybody with me? Any questions? Okay. Now we got to keep going now. We're not stopped. All right. We want to go to verse 13. Where we're going to talk about the Feast of Tabernacles. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days when you've gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you may surely rejoice. Okay, now let me go ahead because I want to read 16 and 17. Why I'll talk to my typist about why my typist didn't add those verses, okay? But we need to go ahead. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. Okay, Feast of Tabernacles. Everybody in here, tell me, does anybody in here have a tabernacle? Anybody? See, you do. See, what is it? Oh, your body. Very good. That's exactly right. Paul says that in 2 Corinthians 5. What about a tabernacle other than your body? Anybody got a tabernacle? Okay, let me ask a different question. Anybody in here own a tent? Anybody? See, you do. You own a tabernacle. You own a tabernacle. Because a tabernacle is a tent. That's all it is, okay? I'm not singling these people out to make fun of them. It's just we don't use that word, do we? I mean, I don't say, I got a tabernacle out in my garage. I don't say that. I don't have one. but if I did have one, I wouldn't say that. It's just not the way we talk. But it's tents, okay. Tents would be a reminder of what? It would be a reminder you don't have a permanent home, right? If I'd lived in a tent, I'm no permanent home. So every one of these feasts, in a certain sense, points their minds to the fact that God took care of them. God provided for them. And being in these tents, or these tabernacles for 7 days, is a reminder that God took care of them. And it's particularly highlighted by what? This is the harvest. This is the end of the harvest. We're going to celebrate because God's given us a bountiful harvest. See, that's the idea that we have here. So this feast, as Brother Dixon said, came at the end of the harvest. This was a feast of rejoicing over the harvest and thanksgiving for the great blessings of God in the harvest. Okay, so that's the purpose of that one. Please do notice that all the males are to be present for every one of these feasts. So why does that matter? Well, you come along later in the book of 1 Samuel, and you meet a woman by the name of Hannah. And what Hannah goes with her husband, Elkanah. She goes up like he does, goes with him. And she's praying, and she wants to have a child. And she makes a promise, doesn't she? She says, you know, when if you give me this child, I'll give him to you. It'll be yours, see? Well, then she has the child, and you do notice that after she has the child, she doesn't go to the feast. She delays. Now, we don't know exactly how long, but it appears she delays at least until the boy is weaned. So in Israel, ladies, you're going to flinch a little bit, but in Israel, they didn't wean them until they were between 3 and 5 years old. See, that's how old they'd be when they finally weaned them. So it may be that when Samuel went up to stay with Eli, it may be that he was 5 years old. I don't know that. Could have been 3 years old. I do know that his mama made him a robe every year. Made him a new robe and brought it to him. I know that. But what I want you to observe is she didn't go to the feast, but he did. Why? Because all the males were expected to go to the feast. It's required by God. And so that's just a story that kind of highlights that, brings that out for us to see that that's what went on. All right, pick up now at verse 18. You shall appoint judges and officers in your gate, which the Lord your God gives you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Okay, Brother Dixon says, we're not told how this was carried out, but the Israelites were to select those who would work in making decisions in matters of dispute. He goes on to say, the place of judgments was at the gates of the city where the judges and officers met. Think courthouse. Anybody know where the courthouse is in Raymond? Yeah, I do. If you've ever been to Raymond, you pretty much know where the courthouse is. It's not the only thing in town, but it's close. There's not a whole lot there. The courthouse is where they handle business, right? Where you pay your taxes on your car, and you can go to vote if you do early voting. If you're old like me and don't want to fight the line, you can go do that there. You can vote there. But they also have court there, don't they? That's where they have court. Okay, where did Israel have their courthouse? At the gates. That's where the judges would sit, is in the gates. Now, I want you to think back, all the way back. Israel has just left Egypt. You suppose anybody ever had a dispute among those folk? Well, they're normal folk, so yeah, they had disputes. And you remember that Moses' father-in-law was there, and he's watching, and you can just about see this line of people. Reminds me of the line when they say they're going to give something free away, and the store don't open till 7, but everybody's there at 5. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so they're all lined up, and one after the other, here come the disputes being brought to Moses, and his father-in-law says to him, hey, you're not doing a good thing. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're wearing these people out too. And so what he suggests he do? He said, well, you need to appoint men, and you put them over different sizes of groups, and it sounds a whole lot like our court system. You go to the courthouse at Raymond, what if you get a judgment you don't approve of? Well, then you appeal it to the next court. Now, I don't know what that is. I'm so thankful. I do not know what that is. I've never found out. But if you lose there, you can appeal it to the next court. And I guess you keep going until you finally get to the Supreme Court. I guess, something like that. Again, I've never had that experience, so I can't really comment on it. But it's kind of how it worked here. There is a type of Supreme Court. Guess what it is? You go to the Levites, ultimately, to the tribe of Levi. And they're going to resolve problem, but not right here. Right here, they're picking people. Now, it's interesting to me how they did it. This reminds me a little bit of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 6. They've got a problem. What do? Look out among you and choose. You see, Moses doesn't designate who's going to be judged. You pick them. You find them. Folks you trust, folks that are honorable. That's the way it worked. As we can see here, 19 and 20, same chapter. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, nor for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Impartiality is a part of the nature of God. You see it. Peter comments on it at Cornelius' house in Acts chapter 10. We'll keep going. We're going to read starting at verse 20. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image near the altar, which you build for yourself to the Lord your God. You shall not set up a sacred pillar, which the Lord your God hates. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or sheep which has any blemish or defect, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. If there's found among you within any of your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, a man or woman who's been wicked in the sight of the Lord your God, in transgressing his covenant, who has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, either the sun or moon or any of the host of heaven, which I have not commanded, and it is told you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is indeed true and certain that such an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman, who has committed that wicked thing, and shall stone to death that man or woman with stones. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. All right, we're going to read a little bit more, but we'll stop there for just a minute. There's several things to pick up on here as we look. First thing is, God doesn't want them to have any part of idolatrous worship. You see that? He's very clear about that. Do not make an idol. Do not set up a tree or a piece of a tree as an image to worship. Now see, we'd all say, what in the world is that? Worshiping trees and that kind of thing. Well, this is a pretty clear reference to the way they worshiped. You got Baal and you got Asherah. These are the 2 primary, it's a god and goddess. Both of them, interesting enough, are considered to be over fertility, both Baal and Asherah. Baal is male, Asherah is female. I'm not going to even describe for you the pole they'd set up. Just a description within itself is despicable. It's deplorable the way they would do it. But they'd set up a tree that would have that image. They'd worship that. See, because after all, Baal's going to give you a good harvest because he's got a fertility, you see, is the idea. I'm not going to describe Asherah either. I've seen some pictures of literal statues that were built to her, and you can tell that she was a sensual representation. Let's leave it at that. That's what she was. But God said, don't be doing any of that. Don't have anything to do with all that stuff. No, I don't want you going there. And in fact, if somebody gets caught doing it, what? Well, he's got some some notes about that we need to consider. They could not, that they had to offer to him, not to any other god. And notice, by the way, when you offer to God, what does he want? Well, he doesn't want defective sacrifices. God wants the best. That was early, by the way. That's at the end of chapter 16, where he said, don't give me a defective sacrifice. See, in other words, you don't go in and look at we're just going to use apples. If you got a bushel of apples, you don't go through and say, which ones of these have bad spots in them? I'm going to give those to God. No, not going to do that. God wants the best, the first and the best, see? So don't, and same way, if you have an animal, maybe you got one with a bad leg. Maybe it's born that way. Or it's defective, so you can't give that to God. See, and truth is, by the way, if you try to run in a bad one in place of a good one, God made you kill both of them. I'm going to teach you. I don't like that. That's not within the bounds of what I want you to do. And so very, very clear. Gossip, notice Brother Dixon's comment about verses 2 through 7 of 17. No gossip was to be used as evidence to convict one of idolatrous worship, since such worship carried with it the penalty of death. Then the accused must be faced by at least 2 witnesses who could confirm the accusations. Compare that with 1 Timothy 5:19. See, if you're going to accuse an elder, and brethren, we need to think about that. I'm thankful to say that I don't hear accusation against the elders here. Okay, so I don't hear anybody even try it. But let me give you a warning, and everybody ought to be on guard. If somebody were to come to me, I said that I don't remember anybody doing that. But if somebody came to me and said, you know what, I've got a problem with one of the elders, the first thing I'd say, don't tell me. Don't tell me. You got to have 2 witnesses at least, according to Paul. 2 witnesses, and where should you go? Really, you ought to take it first to the elder himself. If you got a problem with him, that's the first place to go. And if that fails, take to all the elders. Let them deal with it, But you got to have 2 witnesses. Why is that? Because anything else is gossip. It's me just running my mouth against somebody. See, that don't carry no value. There's no value to that at all. So that's part of the warning. In the case of the theocratic society of Israel, idolatry was treason. It was rebellion against the rule of God through his commandments, and thus subject to capital punishment. Now think about that. A theocracy is where God rules. You say it'll never work. Well, I beg to differ with you, because the whole book of Judges, which lasts over 400 years, it worked. God was in charge. Truth is, God was in charge in the days of Moses. God was in charge in the days of Joshua. And God was in charge in the day of the Judges. So it really goes way past 400 years that God was in charge. A theocracy, where God rules. And so if you're in a theocracy, then you begin to worship an idol. That would be a false god. Aren't you in rebellion against the ruler? Aren't you committing treason? Yeah. So what's going to happen to the guy that commits treason? I can tell you what happens in this country. They execute you. If you're convicted, they'll execute you. Guess what happens in Israel? Same thing. They execute you. That's exactly what goes on. So these are the instructions that we're seeing as we go down through here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and read. Beginning, we already talked about the hands of the witnesses. Pick up verse 8, chapter 17. If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge between the degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. And they shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or the left from the sentence which they pronounce upon you. Now, the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God or judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer act presumptuously. Okay, it's a lot to cover, but let's look at it. Moses dealt with the same type of problem. He was the higher court. As long as he was alive, he was final judge. See, why? Because he'd go talk to God. So why did he go to priests and Levites? They'd go talk to God. See, later, don't you remember? When David needs to know something, he said, can you bring the Urim here? See, the priest, why does he bring the Urim? Because when the priest had the Urim, he's representing God, and he speaks to God and finds out what God wants. You remember one particular incident, I believe it's in 1 Samuel 23, where David's in the little town of Keilah, and he calls for the priest to bring the Urim, and he says, ask God and see if Saul's going to come here to kill me. And the priest checks with God, and God says, yep, he's coming. And he says, well, ask him this. If he comes, will these people... See, David had just rescued that town. He and his men had just saved them from destruction. He says, are these men going to give me over to Saul? And God says, through the priest, he says, yep, they're going to give you up. And so what does David do? He leaves. You can believe what God says. You don't want to die? Get out of this town. That's basically what he's saying. So all I'm doing here is showing you that it transferred this Supreme Court. I'm hesitant to use that, but that's what we understand. Supreme Court originally was Moses, but it came to be with the priest who could consult God. That's where it finally is, wherever God's name is. So it's going to be where the tabernacle is, or later the temple. Depends on what era you're in. I'm not going to deal with the various eras at this point. Kyle and Delitzsch make this point. So in the future, the judges of the different towns will bring all difficult cases which they were unable to decide before the Levitical priests and judges at the place of the sanctuary. I've already kind of mentioned that. A fatal blow or dispute on some civil matter or bodily injury, those are the three things that might come to the Supreme Court. Sometimes the Supreme Court says, we're not going to deal with that. That's in this country. Say, no, we don't have anything to do with that. You solve that down where you come from. It's kind of the answer. Well, same thing here is we should notice. All right, pick up at verse 14. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I'll set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Do you notice that? Does God know they're going to look for a king? He knows. He knows it way ahead of time. Remember, it's more than 400 years later before they ask for a king. But he already knows. You're going to ask for a king. So I'm going to give you directions what you do when you do that. Here we go. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also, it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or the left, and that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. All right, what's going to happen when you ask for a king? Well, that's what he goes through here. And as he goes through this, Israel, when they began this, they only began the process of falling away that's when they sought a king. You ever notice that? Everything was, I'm not saying they didn't sin before that. You read the book of Judges, you know they did. But when they sought for a king, then they take off. It's just like an accelerator, so to speak, that goes on there. The king's trust was being God, not in horses, not in Egypt, and not in his wives. Did you know, if you read the story of Solomon, he violated all three of those. In a certain sense. He married a woman from Egypt. That was his primary queen. He accumulated horses. Wasn't supposed to do that. And yet he did do that. And his wives did what? They turned his heart away from God. He knew. God knew what was going to happen. The king was also to be fully acquainted with the law. Do you know how I know that David didn't do what he was supposed to do? Because he didn't move the Ark of the Covenant the right way. He puts it on a brand new cart. That's pretty honorable, right? That's an honorable thing to do. He puts it on that cart and off they go. Well, poor old Uzzah, the oxen stumble and it looks like the Ark of the Covenant is going to fall off, and he reaches up to keep it from falling, and God strikes him dead. And boy, it upset David. But I want you to notice when David gets the Ark of the Covenant the next time, what does he say? We got to let the priest carry this because that's what God said. Well, you know what? If you'd read the book the first time, you'd have known it before, right? Now, if that doesn't serve as a warning to all of us, I don't know what does. Read the book before you make your decisions. That's really what we're learning. Okay, chapter 18. The priests, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi shall have no part nor inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the offerings of the Lord made by fire and his portion. According to Clyde Woods, Levi was to have no territorial inheritance, but sacred gifts not offered by fire, such as first fruits and tithes, belonged to the priests. That's what they were to eat. All right, pick up verse 2. Therefore, they shall have no inheritance among their brethren. The Lord is their inheritance, as he has said to them. And this shall be the priest's due from the people. From those who offer a sacrifice, whether it's a bull or a sheep, they shall give to the priest the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. The first fruits of your grain and your new wine and your oil and the first of the fleece of your sheep you shall give him. For the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand to minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons forever. Okay, Brother Dixon says, there's a difference here from the portions that were allotted in Leviticus chapter 7, verse 30-34. So we're not going to pretend that there's no difference. There is a difference. The reason for this is that in view of Moses' departure from Israel as the mediator between God and Israel, the original covenant mandates that were given at Mount Sinai are here updated for the people as they settle in the land. See, the requirements in the land would be more than they would be on the road. You can understand that, right? I don't care. I do not pull a trailer with my refrigerator on it wherever I go. Do you? See, so their requirements at home are different than on the road. That's kind of an easy way, from my point, to look at it. Pick up verse 6. So if a Levite comes from any of your gates, from where he dwells among all Israel, and comes with all the desire of his mind to the place which the Lord chooses, then he may serve in the name of the Lord his God, as all his brethren the Levites do, who stand there before the Lord. They shall have equal portions to eat, besides what comes from the sale of his inheritance. When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son, his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination of the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you will dispossess listen to soothsayers and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. I'm going to leave that for next week. That's because that's too important. The prophet like Moses is, of course, Jesus. We're going to talk about that next week. Thank you.